In this section, we are going to discuss the nutritional relationships in an ecosystem. And this is a critical aspect of the ecology of an ecosystem. And so we will spend a little bit of time making sure we understand the nutritional relationships that go on within an ecosystem. Some fundamental definitions. In an ecosystem, there are those organisms which create energy in their life processes, and those are called producers. And essentially, those organisms are able to snatch the energy of the sun out of the environment and incorporate it into their being, such that when they're eaten by the consumer, these organisms, these consumers, can absorb that energy from the producers and use it for their own good. So the producer produces enough energy for its own life and processes, as well as extra energy which the consumers can take in when they eat the producers. Now, the producers have to be able to produce their own food, and so they go by another name that is autotroph. And auto means self, and so they're in their own selves, they are able to take in the food from inorganic sources, and that primary inorganic source is the sun. A heterotroph, on the other hand, must consume the energy that they need in order to survive. They are not able to absorb energy from their environment. They have to consume it through their digestion and then absorb the energy from the food. And so in those heterotrophs, there are several different kinds. One is known as a herbivore. A herbivore is a plant eater, and this rabbit is a nice example of a herbivore. They do not eat animals, they only eat plants, and they absorb all their energy from the plants that they eat, the primary producer. Then there's the carnivore. The carnivore only eats meat, only eats other animals, and so it gets its energy from the herbivore generally, and indirectly gets its energy from the primary producer that the herbivore ate. And then lastly, there are the omnivores. And humans, by the way, are omnivores. Now, omnivores are capable of eating both plants as well as meat and derive energy from both sources. Then there's another group of organisms which are kind of on the side of the environment, as some people think about them, and they are the ones that decompose, or the decomposers. And they essentially eat the dead organic matter. Another name for dead organic matter is detritus. Now, decomposers actually are extremely important, because if they did not exist, then we would be surrounded by dead carcasses of both plants and animals. But because of their existence and the fact that they eat these dead animals and plants, we have a fairly clean and pristine ecosystem. Detrivores are those that eat on dead matter, but they can't, unlike the decomposers, they can't convert this from soil ingredients. So decomposers can take, from within the soil, they can take nutrients out of the soil, whereas the detrivores have to eat intact, dead organic matter. An example of a detrivore would be like worms. Worms cannot eat soil. They can't extract individual nutritional particles from the soil, but they can eat the dead matter that's in the soil, and then they eat that and remove it from the environment. And then ultimately, when they die, they're destroyed by the decomposers. Now, when we think about nutritional relationships, we have to think about the fact that there are levels in the ecosystem to classify these eating relationships. And so one way to classify eating relationship is by trophic level. Now, trophic level is a classification that describes a feeding relationship between organisms. So, for example, the first level must always be a producer of some sort. And it usually, if not always, is a plant or a plant-like organism. So if it's on land, it's basically plants. If it's in the water, it may be organisms that are considered having both plant and animal-like characteristics. And generally, they have to have the ability to convert sun energy into organic energy through the process of photosynthesis. The second level is almost always a herbivore because it eats the first level, and so it eats the plants. And these herbivores eat the plant producer and then become victims for the third level, the omnivores and carnivores that eat. In the case of omnivores, they eat both plants and animals. On the other hand, the carnivores strictly eat animals. And then generally in any particular habitat, in any particular ecosystem, there's what's known as a top carnivore, an apex predator. And that species or that individual is generally a carnivore but may also be an omnivore, but it sits at the top of the trophic pyramid, if you will, and generally it's thought to be almost immune to being eaten. In other words, it dies, but it's generally not killed by another organism and eaten. It just dies of old age, for lack of a better term. Is one of the reasons that humans are called apex predators is because they generally are not killed by other predators. They die of old age. So here's the nutritional relationships I just described in a pyramid sort of situation or diagram. And again, as you see, the first trophic level is the producer, the plant. The second trophic level is the primary consumer or the herbivore. The third trophic level is the secondary consumer or the primary carnivore or primary omnivore. And then lastly, the fourth trophic level, which is generally the top carnivore or the apex predator. And over on the side, you have the detrivores and the decomposers, the organisms that clean up after all of the carnage that occurs in nature around this situation. And it's interesting that there's a quotation, nature red and tooth and claw. And that quotation sort of reflects the eating and feeding relationships that are in the natural ecosystems and natural environment. Now, another way to look at nutritional relationships is to look at what's known as a food chain. A food chain is a model, which means it's something ecologists set up to show the nutritional relationships within the ecosystem. And again, it's very much like trophic levels. In the food chain, you have a primary consumer, which is an organism that's on the second trophic level and that eats the producers directly. Then there are secondary consumers, which is the third trophic level, organisms that eat both producers and primary consumers. Or sometimes they eat just the primary consumer. And then lastly, we talk about the third way to look at nutritional relationships. We've looked at trophic levels, we've looked at food chains, and now we're going to look at something known as a food web. A food web is also a model. And in this model, the ecologists try to show all the possible feeding relationships between trophic levels. Now, up until this point, I've kind of made it pretty straightforward, but the food web introduces some degree of complexity, which when I show you these diagrams, you'll see what I'm talking about. So here's the idea of a food chain. You start with number one, which is the producer, and it's eaten by a grasshopper, which is the primary consumer. Then the grasshopper in number two is eaten by this mouse, and this mouse eating the grasshopper, the mouse is a secondary consumer eating the primary consumer. And then third, the snake eats the mouse, so he's a tertiary consumer. He then is eaten by the eagle or the hawk or whatever that is. It looks like an eagle to me. And the eagle represents the apex predator. And then lastly, when you go through from 5 across back to 1, the decomposers and the detrivores clean up the environment and destroy all the whatever's left over, including the eagle remains after the eagle dies. And so this is a sort of a reflection of a food chain. Now, this next slide looks at the difference between a food chain and a food web. And what you can see is that the food chain is very straightforward. It goes from plants to the primary consumer to the secondary consumer. The secondary consumer dies and is decomposed, and then we start the cycle over again. The food web, on the other hand, shows that everything's not quite this straightforward. And you see that, the apex predator may eat the bird, but it may also eat the squirrel. The grasshopper is eaten by the bird, but then, is also possibly eaten by the squirrel. And the plants are eaten by the grasshopper, but the squirrel may also eat the plants and so forth. And so there's crisscross and more complex relationships in the food web. Now, one thing I wanted to move over to before we end this portion is something called ecological niches. An ecological niche is a function or an occupation of an organism. When they talk about the organism fitting into a niche, what they mean is that this organism somehow fits into a specific thing that it does for the whole ecological situation or habitat, such that if it's removed, somehow the ecological habitat is then disturbed by its absence. And so here's an example of an ecological niche. It's when a habitat or a special area where an organism fulfills some kind of role or function. And this interrelationship with other species is important, both because of its biotic impact as well as the abiotic effect that it may have. So here's some other examples of ecological niches. Now it's interesting in the particular biome where spruce trees live that there are actually 3 types of warblers. The bay-breasted warbler, the Cape May warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler. And each of these have a different place in the spruce tree or niche in the spruce tree where they live. And so the spruce tree is their habitat. That's where they live. And what you can see by the colors is the bay-breasted warbler, for example, hangs out in the middle of the spruce tree. The Cape May warbler hangs out at the top, and the yellow-rumped warbler hangs out at the bottom. And because of this, each of them feeds on a different aspect of the tree. And because of that, the whole system is set up such that it maximizes the survival of both the tree as well as these 3 different birds. Let's look for a minute at energy flow in the ecosystem. The energy flow is related to the consumption of food, and so I thought that before I end this section, I would talk about this. Not all the solar energy that reaches the Earth is captured, and so it doesn't all enter into the food chain. The amount of energy that's available at the end of the food chain is only a small portion of the available energy in the producer. So what that means is, and I'll show you this in a diagram as well, is as you move through the trophic levels or as you move up the food chain, energy is lost. And so you start with a large amount. First of all, you start with the solar energy, and then only a portion of that is captured by the producers. And then as you move up the trophic levels, more and more energy is lost. So for example, you start with the sun, you end up with plants. The plants lose some of the energy, but some of it is then consumed by the primary consumer. There's more energy loss when the primary consumer is eaten by the secondary consumer, and then more energy is lost when the decomposers do their work.